Hello and welcome to this talk entitled Cotton Coal Colonialism, Rethinking the Development of the Fossil Economy. My name is Johanna Siebert and I'm a researcher in international relations and political ecology. I've recently completed my MA in global political economy at the University of Sussex, and I currently work as a freelance researcher in Berlin, Germany. I'd like to start by thanking Liz Connor for organising this amazing symposium on coal-fired colonialism. When Liz invited me over email last summer, I didn't expect to be in such distinguished company. Much of my research is inspired by Andreas Malm's study of fossil capital and also by Deepesh Chakrabarty's work on climate history. So I'm especially thrilled to be part of this inspiring panel, and I'm really looking forward to the discussions over the next few days. The research that I'm presenting today is based on my MA thesis. It was motivated by a general desire to understand how the fossil economy is historically linked to social inequality and exploitation. And here I'm particularly interested in the intersocietal dimension, because in a world that is characterized by a climate crisis but continues to burn fossil fuels, global decarbonization has become an urgent necessity. Yet international negotiations appear futile unless they acknowledge their historically differentiated responsibilities and the need for climate justice, compensation, and reparation. In order to better understand these debates, I believe we must examine the historical connections between the fossil economy and colonialism. However, existing theories of the fossil economy tend to analyze Britain's energy transition in separation from this wider colonial context. And this, I believe, runs the risk of reproducing Eurocentric readings of capitalist development. The result is an element of automation and diffusion in arguments about the internationalization of the fossil economy. And this in turn makes it difficult to account for contradictory developments. For example, the delayed uptake of fossil fuel production in many post-colonial countries. By contrast, a historical analysis that incorporates the geopolitical and geoeconomic context of empire, I believe, produces an adjusted and perhaps even a more dynamic reading of the fossil economy. I'll unpack these statements by first taking a brief look at the existing literature. I then highlight the underlying problem of Eurocentrism and emphasize the need for greater attentiveness to intersocietal relations. In the largest section, I broadly outline my argument. Using the method of radical historicism to foreground the agency of historical actors in their political and geopolitical struggles, I propose a twofold rereading of the fossil economy. I first re-examine the emergence of fossil fuel production in Britain in the wider colonial context. And then I turn to British India in order to analyze the impact of the energy transition on imperial policy. Now, briefly looking at existing explanations for the fossil economy, we can say that they differ in relation to the explanatory factors they identify and the way they attach to colonial relations. Scholars like Edward Wrigley and Richard Wilkinson, for example, emphasize colonial processes. The uptake of coal as the main energy source, they argue, essentially took place out of necessity and was motivated by an accelerating wood shortage in combination with rapid population growth that threatened to undermine economic development. However, given their focus on Britain's ecological makeup, they tend to factor out colonial processes from their account of the energy transition. Then there are economic historians like Joel Mokyr and William Rosen who emphasize institutional and intellectual factors. They argue that the European Enlightenment and the scientific revolution brought institutions and a general innovative spirit, if you want, to Britain. And this gave rise to perpetual technological development and therewith steam technology. However, since they concentrate on domestic institutions and the British intellect, these arguments similarly sideline colonial relations. By contrast, more recent Marxist approaches offer a radically different interpretation, for they argue that fossil fuels acquired their modern meaning only in the context of capitalism's class relations. Starting from this premise, Andreas Malm's Fossil Capital conceptualizes the energy transition from water to coal as an outcome of capitalist class struggle in Britain's cotton industry. In the context of growing union activism, the argument goes, steam technology was adopted because it could be set to work independently from natural variabilities, and thereby provided cotton capitalists with unprecedented power over and independence from labor. Now, this attentiveness to the social relations of power and exploitation surely puts Marxist theories in a better position to make sense of colonial processes. For example, in a study of coal and colonialism, Andreas Malm argues that the fossil economy as a capitalist class relation was forcefully imposed onto the global south by means of coal-powered colonial infrastructure, such as railways and steamboats. This argument provides valuable insights into the connections between fossil fuels, capitalist exploitation, and colonial domination. However, in this account too, colonial relations are implicitly framed as secondary to the original emergence of the fossil economy in Britain. Now, why should this be a problem? I believe that there is an empirical and a theoretical reason. Empirically, British cotton manufacturing, the birthplace of fossil fuel production, was a distinctly colonial and extractive enterprise. It rested on a steady supply of raw cotton from the North American slave plantation. And from the very start, it catered to West African markets where cotton fabrics were traded for slaves that could be set to work on sugar and cocoa plantations. On a theoretical level, and here I'm following post-colonial scholarship, any model that conceptualizes developments within Europe as endogenous dynamics with global ramifications runs the risk of reproducing Eurocentrism. So what do I mean by this? Framing European processes as self-contained developments that subsequently diffuse outwards tends to conceal the historical role of colonial relations in their emergence. Instead, colonialism is rendered a mechanism of diffusion for European processes. And implicitly, then, agency is located with a dynamic West that delivers or imposes change onto the passive East. As a consequence, the conception of fossil capital as an endogenous development of Europe that imposes its logic onto the colonies retains an element of automation that neglects the ambiguous and interactive relation with colonialism. Now, I believe that a way around this lies in foregrounding the intersocietal dimension. However, this is not to deny that fossil-fueled capitalist production did first emerge on the British Isles. Instead, I want to argue for a wider perspective that recognizes the imperial relations at play in these developments. And this, as the post-colonial scholar Gurminder Bambra argues, necessitates a move away from understanding 19th century Britain as a self-contained national entity with a colonial appendage. And instead, we need a conception of colonial Britain as an, and I quote her on this, imperial state. Hereby, developments in the imperial core cannot be separated from processes in the colonial periphery. Now, what does this mean for our historicist analysis? I think that we have to re-examine the industry and the actors of the energy transition, as well as their motivations in the wider geopolitical context of empire. And this means that our analysis must include an assessment of the British cotton industry. Now, I don't have the time to go into detail here. However, it is important to note that British cotton manufacturing essentially developed as an export-oriented industry. When British merchants began to encourage domestic cotton production, this was directly aimed at the imitation of superior Indian textiles in order to substitute them in West African markets. And while it took decades until British cotton was actually accepted by West African merchants, protectionist policies made the industry profitable. So eventually, between 1765 and 1800, as much as 85% of Britain's printed cotton was exported overseas. It appears to me that this unique feature of the industry is crucial to understanding Britain's energy transition. For steam's decisive advantage over water, namely the greater autonomy from labor that it offered, seems to have been particularly relevant to large-scale export-oriented producers. Now, let me pause here and explain what I mean by this. The majority of cotton manufacturers were small-scale, water-powered producers with little access to working capital. While export-oriented economies of scale could be highly profitable, only the large and established producers had access to the financial resources to engage in speculative overseas trade. Their success rested on the smooth operation of large-scale production, and maximizing their autonomy from labor by means of steam power thus became a key priority in the wake of union activism. By contrast, small-scale water-powered mills had much fewer employees and could adjust their levels of production to fluctuations in their domestic trade. They had little incentive to grow much in size because this would have meant entering risky overseas markets for which most of them lacked the financial means. It thus appears as though there wasn't much need for small-scale producers to forego water for steam, especially if we keep in mind that the steam engine was a highly capital-intensive machine. So, what then could have prompted the industry-wide uptake of steam power in the 1830s? I believe that it could have been the sudden availability of easy credit with the rise of joint stock banking following the Banking Act of 1826. Because this opened up the possibility of large-scale export-oriented production to the majority of producers. And with the increased incentive to grow in size also came the growing need for greater independence from labor and thus the incentive to transition to steam. Now, of course, this argument is tentative and still needs more research. However, what it shows is that the actors at the time were distinctly aware of the intersocietal context in which they were situated. And if this was so, how did the agents of the fossil economy navigate this imperial context once fossil fuel production had been generalized? And what does this tell us about the connections between coal-powered production and colonialism? I tried to answer these questions by looking at the case of British India. Now, India is particularly interesting because it was at the center of British imperial policy during the 19th century, and much of this was related to cotton and coal. However, I want to argue that rather than imposing the logics of the fossil economy onto the colony, imperial relations actually stifled the development of fossil fuel production in India. And this was not an automatic consequence of Britain's transition to steam, but a deliberate policy. And this policy was driven by the persistent lobbying of Manchester cotton magnates who sought to direct British imperial relations towards the fulfillment of their dual requirements, namely the supply of raw cotton and the expansion of export markets. To quote just one example here, Manchester's agenda is perfectly summed up by Thomas Bazley, a Manchester cotton manufacturer and a member of Parliament. In 1862, he said, "The great interest of India was to be agricultural rather than manufacturing and mechanical." And indeed, any attempts by Indian cotton producers to industrialize so as to compete with Britain's machine-made goods were met with hostility from Manchester. For example, when the government of India introduced import tariffs on manufactured cotton goods in the late 1850s, one of the greatest concerns of Manchester manufacturers was the advantage these duties would present to aspiring Indian competitors. As a consequence of persistent pressure, they were reduced in 1862 until they were finally abolished in 1882. However, Manchester's interest in Indian affairs had already emerged during the 1840s, and it was largely driven by the looming threat of civil war in North America and the fear of an interruption in the supply of raw cotton. In numerous petitions, different demands were raised, but it was the lack of adequate transport facilities that was identified as the main obstacle to increasing the share of Indian cotton in British manufacturing. Similarly, improved transportation was also considered key to expanding Britain's export of manufactured cotton goods to India. As a consequence, the railways are perhaps the key demand for which the cotton magnates managed to secure the government's commitment. However, as Irfan Habib argues, whereas in Western Europe, the railways promoted industrial development, in India, they offered unprecedented imperial control. Under the rule of a foreign colonial power, the lines were constructed with the aim of facilitating greater resource extraction, access to internal markets, and military control. And Manchester's influence was clearly visible, as you can see on this map. The first lines that were opened from 1853 onwards were designed to connect the British ports to the cotton-growing interior. Thus, the amount of imported cotton goods doubled between 1852 and 1877, leading to the decline of domestic manufacturing and the commercialization of agriculture. The result was what Mike Davis calls a late Victorian Holocaust. Soil depletion and countrywide famines that cost tens of millions of lives, while grain was continuously exported via the railways. Now, if the colonial railways didn't encourage the emergence of fossil-fueled economic development, did they perhaps give rise to an indigenous coal mining industry? In the long run, they certainly contributed to the emergence of large-scale coal extraction. However, for the first 3 decades after construction, the railways were actually primarily fueled by wood. This not only led to the rapid depletion of Indian forests, but even prompted the state to devise a forest conservation policy so as to ensure the continuous operation of the railways. So, in sum, my research tries to demonstrate that the fossil economy cannot be fully understood outside the relations of empire. Highlighting the extractivist and export-oriented nature of Britain's cotton production, I conceptualize the energy transition as a local development with global origins. Moreover, once developed in Europe, the connections between the fossil economy and colonialism appear to be more complex than has been suggested in either mainstream or Marxist history. Rather than imposing the logic of fossil capital onto the colonies, my case study of India suggests that British cotton magnates mobilized colonial relations to arrest rather than promote fossil fuel development in the colony. Now, the relationship between coal and colonialism certainly takes different forms across varying contexts. However, what this implies is that, at least in India, fossil-fueled developmentalism may need to be understood less as a colonial imposition and more as an active post-colonial reaction to centuries of foreign interference. If so, and Here I'm following writers such as Amitav Ghosh and Deepesh Chakrabarti, then fossil fueled nationalist development has acquired a distinctly moral dimension. For in an international environment in which geopolitical competition largely takes the form of competitive economic development, coal and oil still constitute the most immediate means to alleviate poverty on a national scale. Of course, almost always this comes at the expense of communities in the mining regions, thereby producing racist, sexist, and colonial power relations, reproducing racist, sexist, and colonial power relations. And still, the fact that on an international level, fossil fuel developmentalism does bring some sense of historical justice surely contributes to complicating international climate negotiations. Thank you for listening.